You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear bubbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Okay, please come back to the room, wherever you've been flying with the geese. The title of this sermon is Mending Fences, Repairing Relationships. It's by the Reverend Tess Baumberger. Every spring, on my family's farm in eastern South Dakota, brought the task of fixing fence. After the blizzards of winter, the fences would be sagging, even broken in places, from the weight of snow driven by fierce winds. Some of the posts would be leaning, dislodged by the inconsistent earth's freezing and thawing. So each spring, during the years after my sister had gone to college and before my younger brothers were old enough to help, I would help my father for fix fence. We'd walk the barbed wired fence around the pastures on our farm. I'd carry the lighter tools, the pliers, the wire cutters, and the spare clamps. My dad carried this wire stretcher and the post driver. We'd stop wherever the fence needed mending. If the problem was sagging or broken wire, he'd clamp the stretcher in two places where the wire was intact and the ratchet wire, the wire taut. He'd cut the wire held between the stretcher's clamps and use the pliers to reweave the ends tightly together. I'd hold my breath when he released the stretcher until I saw the wire held. If the problem was a leaning or dislodged post, I get to watch Dad drive it back in. The post driver was a cast iron tube with one end blocked with thick metal. My father would put the tube over a post, then rise up on his toes, raising the driver high, then bring it clanging down. I'd cover my ears as he moved up and down in a rhythmic working dance. Gradually, the post would sink straight into the ground as if mesmerized by the grace and fluid strength of my father's movements. I'd watch until it was deep enough, and then I'd tell him, and he'd stop. Dad would clamp the wires onto the post, and we'd move on, walking the fence line. My father died a long time ago, but this is a time of year when I remember him. His birthday was in October, and there's something in the turning of the leaves and the apparent death of so many plants that makes autumn a time when many of us remember those who have died. It may also be a time when we realize and remember that we won't live forever. At the time when our farming ancestors were harvesting and setting up their stores for the winter, we take stock of our lives and see where there is abundance and where things are missing. In a time of cleaning out our homes, we think about how we can put our emotional houses in order as well. It makes sense then, in many religious traditions, fall is a time for mending emotional and spiritual fences with both the living and the dead. The Jewish feast of Yom Kippur is about tending our relationships with the living, but also includes rituals honoring those who have died in the past year to help the living to grieve and move on. We mend fences with those who have died so we can move on from the regret and sorrow that can complicate our grief. We mend and then let go. We mend fences with the living for many of the same reasons. We wish to repair frayed or broken relationships because those breaks can be a source of grief, nagging, and dragging at us. We also mend fences with the living because we recognize that we may not live another year. We would not wish to come to the final parting with such heavy, unfinished business. We would not want to live with the regret of harsh final words or cut off relationships. We would not want our loved ones to live with that kind of pain. Let me tell you 3 personal stories about mending fences to illustrate what I mean. My grandmother died when I was 11 years old with a great secret. We found out after her death that she had a child before she met great-grandfather and gave this child up for adoption. Her sister, my great-aunt Esther, told us about my Uncle D. It turns out that my mother had known him growing up in her tiny hometown of 50 people, but did not know he was her brother. My uncle found out my grandmother was his birth mother when he enlisted in the Navy and saw her name on his birth certificate. Apparently, he made contact with her and sent her letters with pictures of him and his family. My mother had been surprised to discover their correspondence among her grandmother's things. It didn't make sense to her until my great-aunt's visit and that startling revelation. The story of my grandmother's secret ends well. My mother and her other siblings made contact with my uncle. Within a few months, we met him and his wife and later some of his adult children. They became part of our family, exchanging visits yearly and gifts at Christmas. We fixed that fence for my grandmother, reweaving the family to include this lost son of hers. This story is from when I was pregnant with my son. At that point, I had been working through some painful issues from my childhood with a therapist. I'd worked through them at an intellectual level, understanding with my head. But with pregnancy hormones, it all became very emotional. I had a lot of anger at my parents. My dad had died by that point, so I couldn't yell at him. And so my poor mom got the brunt of it. At one point, about halfway through my pregnancy, I called her and said that I was really angry at her and didn't know whether I wanted her to be a part of my life anymore. I said I didn't know whether I'd ever be able to forgive her for some of the things she did and neglected to do. I asked that we not talk for a while until I worked through this and figured it all out. For 3 months, I didn't talk to my mother. I spent a lot of time thinking about her, however. I realized that she did the best she could with what she had. Besides, I knew from seeing her with my nieces and nephews that she was a fabulous grandmother. So I decided I did not have the right to deprive my child of such a terrific grandma. I called her and said that I wanted us to go on, to try and work things out with one another. She came to visit a few weeks after my son was born and was a truly fantastic grandma to him. We have had to agree to disagree about some things, subjects that we could not discuss without fighting. She has apologized for some things, and I forgave her. And I have apologized for others, and she forgave me. She and I worked out a better relationship than what I ever thought possible. By the end of her life, we had a loving, mutually supportive relationship. When my son was a toddler, my relationship with my eldest sister deteriorated. She had been my hero growing up. 10 years older than me, she was and is an artist and a dreamer who encouraged me in my poetry writing. We had fun together. But things fell apart for reasons that I'm not sure I ever really understood. I tried to make contact in order to set things right, but she sent back all my correspondence stamped, refused, returned to sender. This went on for nearly 20 years and only ended when my mother was in her final illness and dying back in 2015. At that point, my sister and I decided to put first things first and to forgive one another and worked to repair our relationships. Through the years, though the years we lost will always be lost, we have regained each other as sisters of the heart as well as genetics. It is such a gift to have healed that breach. As I have been telling these stories, you may or may not have been thinking about your own experiences. You may have loved ones who died with secrets they considered shameful. You may have some yourself. You may have a tough and unresolved relationship with a loved one, living or dead. You may have experienced cut-off relationships with family members or friends, some of which you'd healed and some of which still weigh on you. We may have loved ones deceased or living with whom we have tattered or broken relationships. We may have some emotional fences between us too long unwalked and unmended. Sometimes it is years before we fully realize those strands of love were broken or strained under the weight of cold words whipped by fierce winds. If we can find the places where our own actions have strained or broken the wires, those are the places where we have the power to act to mend them. Taking stock of our own actions and holding ourselves accountable for them breaks the victim mentality and gives us power. Recognizing our part in any breaks shows us where our power is or can be. Sometimes it takes a while to recognize where the behaviors meant to support the strands of love need to be straightened and grounded. If we have patience with the process, we can find those places. We can work there to do what we can to repair what has been strained or broken. So let us today, in this time of taking stock, preparing for winter, turn our hearts, minds, and spirits toward mending fences. This is a good time to perform that act of connection. Let us do this so that we and our loved ones may find peace with one another. So I invite you to enter into this metaphor. Picture yourself walking the fence with someone you love. Picture that person walking on the same side as you, or the other side if that person has died. You're strong enough to carry all the tools. You can see where the fence needs mending. You walk along, touching with tenderness the places where the strands of love are strong and whole, where the supports stand straight. Sometimes you touch the same places as your loved one, sometimes different places. You stop wherever the wire sags or is broken. You may look remorseful or sad for a moment, but then you get to work. You clamp the stretchers onto intact pieces in the strands and pull them closer together. You work to make the strands straight again. You cut where they need to be cut, and together with you reweave the ends. You hold your breath as you undo the clamps and smile when you see the line is holding firm. If it breaks, you try again, stretching, reweaving, making stronger. You stop at the places where the posts, the deeds that support our strands of love, are leaning or uprooted. You straighten them and together perform the rhythmic, working dance until they are deep, grounded, and rooted once again. You reattach the wires, you move on. Eventually you come to the end. Your work is done. And the fence is mended whole again. You may reach out, sometimes through and across the strands, to hug one another. You move on together or in your separate directions with peace in every step. You return here to this place, you rest. As with mending real fences, mending these emotional fences needs to be done at least once a year, especially with the living. Every year there are places where the strands of love become strained or broken under the weight of cold, hard words. There are places where the acts to support those strands need to be straightened and rooted again in daily practice. May you find ways to mend fences with the living and the dead, bestowing the blessing that recognizes your mutual goodness, bestowing the blessing that releases you from the burden of regret and allows you and your loved ones to be in peace. So may it be. Amen. Blessed be. Blessed be. Now we will sing the hymn 1037. That's in the Teal Book. 1037.